Good day, everyone, and welcome to the National Spectrum Management Association's webinar, Deploying Unlicensed 6 GHz RLANs While Protecting the Fixed Service. This is being presented by George Kizer, former president of the National Spectrum Management Association. I wanted to start with some preliminaries and then give you George's background. The preliminaries are that at scheduled breaks, we'll have about 5 minutes for Q&A, short Q&As during the roughly 1 hour presentation. And then we'll have a longer Q&A at the end. The shorter Q&A, we'll try to cap it around 5 minutes just so we can keep the pace and cadence of the presentation moving along. My name is Joseph Sondry. I'm president of the National Spectrum Management Association. George Kizer, who's presenting today, has 48 years of experience in telecommunication systems with his main focuses on fixed point-to-point microwave systems. He's the author of Digital Microwave Communication, and has contributed chapters in the Handbook of Microwave Technology. He's also the author of several peer-reviewed technical articles. George is also currently chairman of the Telecommunications Industry Association, TIA, Working Group for Microwave Systems. He's editor of the Wiley Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers series on RF and microwave and technical chairman of the Fixed Wireless Communications Coalition. He's previously president, the most recent past president of the National Spectrum Management Association, which is hosting today's webinar. And he's chairman of TIA's Fixed Point-to-Point Microwave section. George authored ComSearch's Microwave Path Design course and teaches Microwave Path Design Fundamentals. After 24 years at Alcatel, George retired as their product manager for microwave radios and radio network managers. He previously served as program manager for domestic projects there and is a lead engineer for international projects in Western Europe, North Africa, and South Korea. George holds both a Bachelor's of Science and a Master's of Science degrees in electrical engineering and is a life member of IEEE and an NSMA fellow. So welcome, George, and thank you we're honored to have you present today at today's webinar. Take it away.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that. Today we'll be talking about deploying unlicensed 6 GHz RLANs while protecting the fixed service. We'll have 3 quick Q&A breaks during the presentation, and then a longer opportunity to ask questions after we get to the end of the presentation. So who the heck is NSMA? Well, NSMA is a voluntary organization that's been around since 1984. We were organized at the request of the FCC to put together recommendations to help operators implement the Commission's rules and regulations. We certainly have done that. We have a number of recommendations on our website to help you implement FCC rules. And we also were involved in the regulatory process in Washington for the various activities that are going on, most notably the introduction of unlicensed devices into the 6 GHz band. Things got started in North America in 1934 when the FCC was organized, and a little later in 1978 when NTIA was formed. These two organizations regulate spectrum in the United States, and they use the table of allocations approach for frequency allocation. The basic idea of band allocation is to assign comparable services to a particular segment of the frequency. The good news is this is administratively efficient, but the bad news is this allocation by allocation process is not particularly spectrally efficient. If you notice, you see that with the allocation of users in the 6 GHz band. We, of course, are very familiar with lower 6 GHz and its high utilization, and then the upper 6 GHz with its utilization of more narrowband channels. But we also have a number of users at 6 GHz supporting special events and also supporting the broadcast functions. But as you can see, the number of transmitters in these bands is highly dependent on the particular service that was allocated in that band. Well, here's what 6 gigahertz, lower 6 gigahertz looks like in the United States. Very high utilization. Lots and lots of links. We have approximately 100,000 transmitters in this in the United States today. Last couple of years, there's been a lot of motivation to increase spectrum utilization. We see a lot of activity in that regard. A number of politicians want higher density use of the spectrum, and they want to support wireless activity. That's been very important politically for the last few years. In response to that, a consortium of Silicon Valley groups in early 2018 made a proposal to the FCC to introduce unlicensed radio LANs into the 6 gigahertz band. What they were proposing was to put approximately 1 billion unlicensed devices across the United States. These devices would be operating in bandwidths between 20 megahertz and 160 megahertz bandwidth. They would be using time division duplex modulation. And the initial proposal was to have no frequency management of these devices whatsoever. Later in 2018, the FCC released a notice of proposed where they proposed that members of the industry comment to the commission on how or if unlicensed operation could be introduced into 6 gigahertz. As you could imagine, there was quite a bit of industry activity on that matter, and lots of competing opinions. All of that information is available today on the FCC's website that has a record of all of those public documents. A year and a half later, April of this year, the FCC released a report and order proposing rules for introduction of wireless devices into 6 gigahertz. What they proposed was to authorize unlicensed operation in the entire 6 gigahertz band, 5.9 to 7.1 megahertz. They proposed to do that with 2 different types of devices. A standard power device could be used indoors or outdoors, but it would be under the control of an automatic frequency coordination system, or an AFC. We'll hear a lot about AFCs later in this discussion. The indoor units would be low power, but they would be authorized with no frequency management device. That has been very interesting. There's been a lot of concern within the industry on this, that low power devices, so-called indoor, could be used without any frequency management. The devices we're talking about are called access points or client devices. The access point is the device that would be connected to the internet, and it would provide communication to client devices, which would connect to the access point. Typically, the access point would have higher transmit power. The client device would be lower. Access points would be typically like what you have today. The Wi-Fi devices that you currently have in your homes or offices today would be a typical access point. Client devices could be your phone, a computer, television, whatever device needs to communicate with the access point to gain communication with the internet. Those were the types of devices that the Commission was proposing. For the standard power devices, AFC operators would be designated by the FCC to oversee the operation of standard power RLANs. The report and order allows the standard power devices to be operated under the control of an AFC, but it allows the low power devices to be operated indoors without any control whatsoever. The Commission, in addition to offering the rules for this operation, supported the formation of an industry multi-stakeholder group to provide technical and operational support for mitigating interference concerns. But the Commission didn't offer any of those on its own. The Commission also supported industry testing, but again, did not mandate it. I'd like to emphasize that the fixed microwave community retains its primary status. It has no coordination requirement with the unlicensed devices, and the unlicensed devices cannot cause interference to the fixed service. Now, there's a lot of concern among the fixed service operators on whether or not the low power devices, which will be unmanaged, will it cause interference or not. There are a number of issues associated with that, and we'll talk about some of those. The Commission created 4 new unlicensed bands. Currently, it has 6. It introduced 4 new ones called Uni5, 6, 7, and 8. Uni5 is our typical lower 6 gigahertz band. Uni7 is the so-called upper 6 gigahertz band that we're familiar with as fixed users. The standard outdoor access devices can operate in those bands under the control of an AFC. The low power indoor units, however, can operate across all 4 of those uni bands, but they will not have any control by a coordinating device whatsoever, and any interference associated with that will have to be managed by the user, and we'll talk about that in just a few moments. It's interesting that the RLAN operators, the RLAN providers expect to offer mostly outdoor units. Their expectation is that when the dust settles, they'll have 1 billion of these units within the United States, but 98% of those will be indoor units and not managed. Only a small percentage, obviously, of those would be outdoor units managed by an AFC. All right, let's take a break for a second and see what kind of questions we have. Okay.
So, yeah, for those folks who may have questions, there's just as a reminder, there's a Q&A and a chat button below if you want to post them. And the moderator control person from James McPherson can also open up microphones if people want to ask a question verbally. So we'll give it a moment and see if anything's posted. Otherwise,
we'll proceed.
We are asking, Mark McHenry is asking if slides will be made available, and they will. We will be making those this recording available on the NSMA website. Does anyone have any questions for George at this point?
Okay, well, I see no questions, so we'll just proceed. Okay, the RLAN
George, we just a question just came in from David Lubar.
Oh, okay.
Do any of the UNI uni channels provide any threat to satellite earth stations in 7125? Is the question.
Supposedly not. Let's see, hang on a second. Okay, for some reason I don't see the question, but at any rate, no. The Commission is of the opinion that any satellite operations in the Uni 8 band would not be interfered with. All of those devices supposedly would be adequately suppressed by building entry loss and activity factor. Now, I'll have to point out that everything that the Commission has been done without any actual testing whatsoever. The Commission has taken action and created rules based on public documents, but without benefit of any testing whatsoever anywhere in the world. This has never been done before. So whether or not interference is suppressed as we hope it to be remains to be seen. This is brand new, totally out of the box thinking by the commission. So what really happens is we'll find out. But theoretically, the commission says they've looked at these satellite interference up at 7.125 and they're convinced that there will be none. Now, I leave that to your imagination as to whether or not that's actually going to be the way it works. Nobody's tested that.
There's also a question from Diane Supinski. George mentioned something about us not needing any coordination requirements or something to that effect. I'm just wondering if category B antennas would negate our incumbency.
Okay, the question is, would category B antennas negate your incumbency? No, the primary users are still primary. Category B antennas only, the difference between a category A and a category B only would be significant if a new primary user is attempting to put in a link and cannot do it because of your B antenna, but could if you had an A antenna. He can force you to upgrade your antenna. But that's just another primary user. The unlicensed RLAN users have no primary status. They're secondary. They have no primary status and they cannot cause any change to a primary licensee. So no, there is from an unlicensed perspective, there is no difference between a category A, category B antenna. You with a category B antenna must be protected from interference by the unlicensed user.
Great.
Any other questions?
No open questions, so it looks like we've hit 5 minutes. We can on the first Q&A break. There'll be more Q&A breaks to follow.
All right, let's proceed then. Okay, what will be the transmit powers for these RLAN devices? Well, for the low power devices, well, for all of the RLANs, the power is a function of power per megahertz. So it varies depending on the channel bandwidth of the RLAN device. You've got bandwidths from 20 megahertz up to currently 160, although the commission has authorized the use of 320 megahertz channels as yet undefined. But the actual interference into a fixed service receiver will be limited by the bandwidth of the fixed service receiver, as well as, of course, the bandwidth of the RLAN transmitter. Most typically for the fixed service receivers, we have 30 megahertz channels, and we've calculated the transmit power that would appear in those channels. You notice that for the higher power access points for the unlicensed low power units, the power into a 30 megahertz channel never increases more than about 20 dBm EIRP. On the other hand, the standard power indoor-outdoor units that will be managed by an AFC, their power does vary. And into a 30 megahertz channel, it varies from about 26 dBm to as high as 36 dBm. So significantly higher power, as much as 16 dB greater, but hopefully that power will be managed by an AFC. So hopefully with the standard power units, there will be no interference. And if there is, that can be mitigated by an AFC operator. An interesting contentious factor that came into the discussion in the last 3 months of the discussion on bringing RLANs into the 6 gigahertz band is transmit activity factor. In December, Cable Labs came up with a report that suggested that the activity factor for RLANs will be very low. In other words, most of the time, the RLANs will not be transmitting. And therefore, since most of the time they are not transmitting, they most of the time will not interfere with the fixed service. The Cable Labs proposed that the activity should be averaged, and the commission agreed with them. So the commission is of the opinion that if the activity factor of RLANs is very low, the probability of interference between RLANs and fixed service receivers would be very low. Now, we didn't get much opportunity to discuss this. I say fixed service didn't. This issue came up in December of last year, and the commission ruled on it in April. And only Cable Labs offered any definitive information on this. Whether or not activity factor really represents the interference of RLANs into fixed service receivers is not clear. It's never been tested. The fixed service community has pointed out that RLANs, regardless of their transmit activity, will have high full transmit power beacons being transmitted by the RLAN access points 10 times a second. And they're of the opinion that those may cause interference regardless of whether there's any transmit activity from the RLANs themselves. Whether or not this is the case is yet to be determined. To our knowledge, it's never been tested. So this is an interesting factor that's in contention between the RLAN and the fixed service community. Excuse me. The issue here is that currently in the 5.8 gigahertz unlicensed band, RLANs use TDD technology. In other words, time duplex division transmission. The concept of TDD is you use one radio channel to transmit and receive. You transmit for a while, then you receive for a while. That is very frequency efficient, as was necessary at 5.8 since there was very little frequency bandwidth available anyway. So you've used frequency very efficiently, but there's significant latency because you're transmitting and receiving alternatingly on the same channel. The latency over the channel is relatively high, typically several milliseconds. Several milliseconds is not going to go over too well for people who want to support 5G transmission. One of the requirements for 5G is you have latency less than 1 millisecond. Well, the only way to achieve that is to use frequency division duplex. That requires transmission and reception on 2 different channels. Now, of course, with the new rules, there'll be plenty of channels available, so the RLANs can implement frequency division duplex, but unfortunately, the activity factor for that will typically be on the order of 100%. You'll be transmitting and receiving at the same time. Of course, that's necessary if you want your latency to be very, very low, less than a millisecond. But in that case, the transmission activity factor will be 100%. So for FDD systems, activity factor will not be a factor. The Fixed Wireless Communications Coalition has asked the Commission if they think that activity factor is an important reduction in interference, then they should put it in the FCC rules. Currently, it is not. So whether or not activity factor is important and whether it should be in the rules is an issue in front of the community today. Another important consideration is building entry loss. It's not, the Commission is quite clear that they believe that low power RLANs don't need to be managed because they will be inside buildings. The Commission is of the opinion that the typical building entry loss is 20.6 dB, and with that kind of entry loss coupled with a very, very low activity factor, there should be no interference. However, we know that building entry loss could vary widely depending on the particular building and the geometry with the microwave paths. In particular, we're concerned about loading docks, covered balconies, picture windows, conference rooms, and corner offices. But the Commission believes that those will not happen very often and that we shouldn't be worried about that. Nevertheless, building entry loss is critical to the suppression of transmission of indoor RLAN transmitters, and we're we're hoping that the billing entry loss will generally be sufficient to suppress those transmissions. I would like to point out that IPOSI has the technology to measure building entry loss, if that's of interest to people. That can be done. Now, what is this AFC device that I was mentioning? The AFC device, the automatic frequency coordination device, is a bit of a misnomer. This device is not coordinating anything. It's assigning frequencies. The process is really automatic frequency assignment. The licensed holder doesn't get a vote in the process. The AFC just goes off and determines what's the appropriate the frequency and power for the RLAN and makes that assignment. The propagation loss between the RLAN to the fixed service receiver is now by law to be estimated using a couple of models, WINR2 and ITM propagation models. Those are now required to be used for propagation loss estimation in accordance with the FCC rules. The rules say that the interference protection criteria is an I over N of -6 on a per RLAN device. There's no accumulation of interference power, and it's not clear how interference is to be calculated, specifically how activity factor would be folded into that calculation. FCC believes it should be considered, but it's not clear how it would be considered. That will need to be decided by the multi-stakeholder group to be formed later. It's interesting that the characteristics of the fixed service will be taken from the FCC's ULS database. That's a very important consideration because all the fixed service paths are ostensibly in the ULS database, but the ULS database is not always accurate. We'll have some more to talk about that later, but if you're a fixed service operator, it's very important that your ULS database entries are accurate if you want protection from the AFC. Lastly, I'll just point out that the AFC will be funded by the RLAN operators. The fixed service operators are to be protected, but they're not paying for the operation of the AFC. We're hoping that the AFC will do the appropriate thing for the fixed service, even though the fixed service operators are not paying for that function. We're a little concerned about interference mitigation. If a fixed service path is being interfered with by a standard power RLAN, how do you go find out who's causing that interference? How many AFC units do you need to query, and who will make that inquiry? If you're being interfered with by a low power indoor unit, there's no one to go to. It's up to you to go figure that out. Do you have the capability of determining interference and finding out where it's being caused and mitigating that interference? Interesting question, not resolved currently. Maybe interference bounty hunter will be a new job description. Maybe Joe and I need to go off and consider that for a new job opportunity. At any rate, it looks like there's going to be an opportunity for somebody to go out and determine interference and figure out what to do with it. Okay, let's have another break and see if we have any more questions.
All right, one is posted. Dane Erickson is asking, is the FCC, if the FCC is so convinced that indoor unlicensed devices will not cause interference to incumbent users, why not open up federal government bans to unlicensed use as well? Or is the NTIA not as gullible as the FCC? That's Dane Erickson.
Okay, well, it is very frustrating to, obviously you can tell I'm a little biased toward the fixed service operation. I'll have to admit that I am. But as you're probably aware, the commission has decided there's not going to be any interference due to low power devices, but they've made no plans for mitigation of that interference. They'll just say the multi-stakeholder organization will go figure that out, figure out how to deal with that. And they don't consider that to be important. NSMA 2 years ago requested the commission to do some testing before they made these decisions. And we also asked them to intercede on our behalf with NTIA to make spectrum available so that we could migrate to that spectrum if in fact there was problem with interference at 6 gigahertz. The commission declined to do that. Now I will point out to you that NSMA and FWCC have been interceding in fixed service behalf to try to gain access to NTIA spectrum since the mid-1990s. I know that because I've personally been involved in it. So for about 25 years, we've been attempting to get the NTIA to agree to allow us to share spectrum. And even though they continue to say they're agreeable to that, they've declined to make that that spectrum actually available to us. So far there's been lots of talk, but absolutely no action toward allowing any commercial fixed service operator to share spectrum with the federal government. And I'm not expecting that to change unless there is some political impetus to cause that to happen. That will not happen without political intervention. Go talk to your senators and representatives.
And there's an additional, thank you, George. There's an additional question from Joseph Gross. And if interference is due to an aggregate of multiple RLANs, do you shut all down or one by one until interference stops?
If you have aggregate transmitters causing interference, the question is, do you shut down individual transmitters or do you shut down everyone? There's no guidance on that, but my expectation is we just start shutting people down if the interference became manageable. Probably, I mean, our experience with NSMA's experience with interference is usually the primary interference is caused by a single user or a few users. Rarely do you have lots of aggregate interference. So our expectation is that the interference will probably be caused by somebody in a conference room with wide window access or corner office, or maybe an RLAN in a loading dock or out on a balcony, something like that. And you would shut that guy down. If you did that, you would probably reduce most of the interference. However, in looking at possible interference cases, we've seen a number of cases where you have hotels or apartment buildings where you have dozens of windows all opening up onto a fixed service receiver, and all of them could have RLANs. So our experience to date, where most interference cases are a single or second or dual or triple interference case, may not apply in the future. If you have 1 billion of these devices spread out through the United States, you may have multiple transmitters in apartments, hotels. In that case, aggregate interference may be an issue, but that remains to be seen. Today, it's typically not.
George, thank you for that. We have 2 other questions, and we're kind of close to the 5-minute second Q&A limit. We're going to have multiple other Q&As available later, but I'll read you those questions, and then we'll close the questions for this section. Lynn Burnett asks, states the greater concern is that when interference occurs and is identified to the source, how will there be any teeth to stop this offender from causing the interference? This seems to be lacking.
Okay, I'll talk about how you handle interference cases at the end of the presentation. Yeah. We will discuss that.
And David Pope asks, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing anyone's names, but David Pope asks, if the RLAN is the support for the AFC, will fixed service operators have an opportunity to be part of the AFC at some point? So those are the 2 questions.
Okay, would you read the second question again, please? I'm not following that.
If the RLAN is the support for the AFC, will fixed service operators have an opportunity to be a part of the AFC at some point?
Okay, that's an interesting question. The participation of operators with the AFC at this point is not clear. Now, it's obvious the AFC will be supporting the RLAN operation, and there is nothing in the rules to suggest that any participation by the fixed service is required or available. So it's unclear how the fixed service operators will interact with the administration of the AFC. That is yet to be determined. Presumably it will be determined by a multi-stakeholder group that's being formed right now. Whether or not what that turns out to be at this point is not clear. It's certainly not included in the rules. Okay, let's proceed. And if we have any further discussion, let's get into it on our next break.
Thank you, George.
Okay, what's the next step? Well, first of all, the Commission has created their rules without benefit of any practical experience whatsoever. What they've done has never been attempted anywhere else in the world, and it's not been tested anywhere. Well, Commission suggests that it would be appropriate to have some testing before devices are deployed. Well, excuse me, several commenters suggested that the Commission should have testing prior to any device being deployed. The Commission did not invoke that consideration. They went ahead and authorized the introduction of devices, but they did support the concept of testing. And today we as NSMA would invite stakeholders to do that testing. We think it's very important that it happen before we see a wide deployment of these devices. The interference detection and mitigation process per the Commission should be a multi-stakeholder group. That group is being created today by WinForum. The organization meeting is going to occur the end of July, so it's in the process of being created. Whether or not it actually happens and who will be on that committee remains to be seen, but at least there is movement in the industry today to create the multi-stakeholder group that would develop, among other things, the interference mitigation procedures. There are many issues that need to be developed to mitigate interference, and it is hoped that the multi-stakeholder group will help define that. The Commission, OET in particular, Office of Engineering and Technology in particular, wants to be a liaison in that process, but they, again, want this to be an industry initiative. They don't want to edict how this is done. We're suggesting, NSMA is suggesting, that a wide range of testings are necessary. You need testing by the incumbents, but you also need testing for the different types of systems that will be deployed. And obviously there are at least 3 unlicensed types of systems that are currently envisioned. Standard power, managed by the AFC, low power that will be unmanaged, and very low power that's today would be indoor, but would also be unmanaged. But the very low powered is thought of as being the personal devices such as virtual reality headsets and other devices of that sort that might be used within a home or an office environment that might not require conventional access to the internet. So 3 significant different types of utilization for RLANs, as well as, of course, the fixed service operation. So each of those would have their own testing regimen, and obviously would be rather different. There is a national laboratory available for that testing. It would be available out in Idaho. It'd be a long way away from anywhere else, and of course today in the era of coronavirus considerations, getting out to Idaho might be a bit of a challenge. But if that can be resolved, you do have a facility that would be willing to support this activity. It would be away from any other interference sources, would be completely isolated, and allow you to do testing that would be completely unencumbered by any kind of urban interference today. NSMA would recommend that industry members join together to do this testing. If you would like to participate in multi-user testing, we would appreciate if you would email us at president@nsma.org. We would like your support in testing these various systems. This is something that we think is very important. The Commission supports it, but as yet we do not have any significant testing planned. Perhaps that will change in the near future. We certainly hope so. Now, last break. Any other questions?
So there's a question from Dane Erickson. What is the status of stay petitions both at the FCC and the DC Court of Appeals?
Okay, AT&T has requested that has filed a petition with the court in Washington D.C. asking for a stay of the rules. There has not been a decision on that yet. That petition was filed a couple of weeks ago. The court has yet to rule on that. So it's to be determined. Don't know yet. Anything else?
Let me check. I don't see any other questions. Any other questions? Don't see any more. One statement we're setting up, you'd mentioned the email president@nsma.org, which was just put in place. I think there might be an issue with that working today, but it'll be working later this evening. So people can also email joe@thoughtdelivery.com. We'll send a note to everyone where people can send to president@nsma.org. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Joe. All right, folks. Well, keep your thoughts in mind and hold off on emailing to president@nsma.org until tomorrow or later this week. And we look forward to your emails. We look forward to your support on testing. I can't tell you how important it is to do testing of real live systems. These rules are extremely impactful to 6 gigahertz, and yet nobody has actually tested anything that's being proposed here. Well, I'll get off that soapbox and move forward. Okay, so much for how we got to where we are today. Next question is, so what? What do we do? There are 3 specific things that you can do that as an operator to help your situation. We'll talk about each of those individually. First of all, verify your ULS data. The AFC will be protecting fixed services based on the data that's in the FCC's ULS database. If your data is not accurate or complete, you may not get protected. And so it's extremely important that if you have fixed service licenses, you go to the FCC database and confirm that your system is accurately in there. Now, I'll point out that this only applies to lower 6 and upper 6 gigahertz fixed service users, because they're the folks that have data in the ULS database. The folks in Uni6 and Uni8 do not appear in the ULS database and will not receive protection from AFC. But keep in mind, the AFC is not in Uni6 and Uni8. The only devices that will be managed by AFC are in the Uni5 and Uni7 band, or what we know as lower 6 and upper 6 gigahertz fixed service operation. The folks in the Uni6 and Uni8 band, you know, the mobile operators or the broadcasters support. The RLANs that are operating there are going to be indoor and they're not managed. So updating the ULS database obviously does not apply to them. But at any rate, here are the contacts for the major coordination houses that will be happy to help you verify your ULS data and correct it if necessary. but a very important aspect of protecting your system. You need to be sure your data is correct. Next, you need to do a risk assessment of your network. Plot out your paths in Google Earth and determine, do they go close to buildings that might house unlicensed RLANs? Do they go by apartments? Do they go by hotels? Do they go by any buildings that might have one or more of these RLANs? If they do, then you need to assess whether or not interference is likely from those devices. Now, there are various, you can do that yourself, or there are various consulting groups that will be willing to help you with that activity. But at any rate, you need to do a risk assessment to see whether your paths have potential for problems. Next, you must become prepared. You need to establish a baseline for your system. What is the performance of each of your paths today? Do the errored seconds directly relate to path fading, or do they occur even when there's not significant path fading? You should use your management system to determine if you're picking up severely errored seconds on your path. Is your RSL going down to radio threshold when this happens? If it does, that's probably to be expected. So you would be looking at errored seconds probably on 15-minute intervals, and you would be looking at RSL on 15-minute intervals, and you would be comparing those two and see if they're rational. If you are receiving severe errored seconds and you're not seeing fading to radio threshold, that's indicative of some other degradation. If that fading is occurring one direction but not the other, you probably have interference. But at any rate, the only way you will determine if your path is starting to degrade is by establishing a baseline. If you've determined that you have interference, now you need to start the interference mitigation process. So you go get your interference bounty hunter, or perhaps you hire someone to fly the path. For example, Tom Drinkwater provides a service where he can take a drone with a spectrum analyzer on it and fly a path and determine if interference is occurring on that path, and if so, where along that path it's occurring. That's one opportunity. I have no stock in Tom's company, so no concern to me whether or not you offer that. But that is a service that's available, and I'm sure that interference bounty hunters will become available as this need arises. But the first thing you need to do is determine, do you have interference? And you've got to do that by establishing baseline performance of your microwave path. And again, consultants are available who can help you with that if you don't have the staff to do that. Lastly, you need to be prepared to take action. Okay, you've got interference on the path, but you're not able to resolve it. Now, what should you do? Now, the commission would prefer that you resolve the interference. They don't want to get involved unless they have to. But that's just the way it is. But if there is interference occurring and you've not been able to resolve it, you need to at least find out where it's occurring. And here is a checklist of the items that the commission wants you to provide if you come to them with an interference issue. You fill out this list of items that you need in terms of where the interference is coming from, and then you take that to the Commission Spectrum Enforcement Division. There are several people that can help you with that. Offer some information in that regard here, but basically you need to find the interference and then take it to the commission. If the interfering source will not resolve the interference, the FCC will get involved and help you resolve that interference. Well, things have really changed since the early 1900s. We're now in the era of frequency management with differing transmitter types within the same band. That is a significant change in frequency management over the last century. This is a totally new era. We're evolving to a new frequency management paradigm. I certainly hope that we can make it work. If it does, we'll be able to manage spectrum much more efficiently than we have in the past, but it's certainly going to be a big change from what we've been dealing with up to this point. If you would like to be involved, please join our organization. We look forward to working with you to do frequency management in the 21st century. It's certainly going to be different than what's happened in the 20th century. Do we have any more questions?
We do. There's, I think, a statement from Dane Erickson and a question from Brett Bonamo. The statement from Dwayne is, whoa, 7 gigahertz, the Uni 8 band, Part 74 TV SDLs, TV ICRs, and TV pickup stations are most definitely in the ULS. I guess that's more of a statement versus a question. Presumably, you think that statement's accurate. Brett asks, he says, step 2 was performance risk assessment. Can you please elaborate on what that would entail?
Okay, well, first, Dane's comment. Yes, your broadcast services are in Uni 8, but there's no service that will be taking advantage of that information. Uni 8 will not be managed by AFC because there will be no standard power RLANs authorized in that band. The only RLANs authorized in that band are the low power indoor units, and they're not going to be managed. So the fact that you have licensed units in a ULS database is irrelevant because there will be no management function of those. So it'd be nice that you had your ULS data updated, but there's no one that's going to be taking advantage of it. You're on your own to determine interference and mitigate that. Okay, the question is, what do you do if you've got interference? Well, the Commission has not offered any suggestions on what you do if you have interference from either the standard power or low power RLANs. The assumption is that if you have interference from standard power RLANs, you will be interacting with the AFC operator to resolve that interference. Whether that happens, or if that happens, or under what circumstances that would happen, are undetermined, but I'll point out the AFC operator serves the RLAN units. It doesn't serve the fixed service community. So how the AFC operators interact with the fixed service community has yet to be determined, but the assumption is that they will in some way in such a way that they can protect the fixed service community, and the fixed service users will be satisfied with that interaction, whatever that is. With regard to interference on the low power devices, so-called indoor units, that's a Wild West. It's everybody for himself there. The Commission takes no responsibility for frequency management of that, and if there is a problem, it's up to the operator to determine it and try to resolve it, and if they can't, bring it to the Commission. Well, first thing is, how do you find the interference? Well, that will be very challenging. Anyone who's attempted to find interference knows how difficult that really is. My expectation is that the only practical way to deal with that is to use something like what Tom Brink-Odemeyer has come up with, is to use a drone with a spectrum analyzer on it and fly your path and find out where that interference is occurring. And once you find the building where the interference is occurring, then you go into the building with a spectrum analyzer and find out which room or office is causing that, and try to resolve that. But that's going to be a problem that the fixed service operator has to deal with. It's undefined. It's not controlled. There's no process for that. and the commission will get involved if they have to, but only if you bring them a problem that they can deal with. But there is a process for that. I mean, the Spectrum Enforcement Bureau has offices all over the United States. You can bring problems to them. I've indicated to you the folks who would like to be involved in that, but you know, it's going to be on the operator to resolve that if there is in fact interference.
And Brett is elaborating more on his question. He thanks you for what you've said so far on elaborating what that would entail. He also writes, respectfully, the question is in the context of what to do now before the interference occurs. The item in the slide was performance risk assessment after ensuring that the ULS information was accurate.
Right, you've determined that ULS information is accurate. That should help you with standard power RLANs. But the other thing that you have to do is validate how your paths are performing today. You know, baseline the performance of your paths. Monitor your network management over a year's period. Take 15-minute performance data, severely erred seconds and unavailable seconds. See when they're happening on your network and confirm during that period of time that your received signal level is going down to threshold, radio threshold. If your radio is fading to radio threshold when your erred seconds are occurring, the path is probably performing normally. If you're getting severely erred seconds or unavailable seconds and your path is not fading down to threshold, then you probably have another problem, most likely interference. If that is the case, I would strongly recommend that you take the path out of service and perform a fade margin check. That can be done. It's a fairly straightforward procedure, but it does require you to take the link down. But at least it would determine whether or not interference is actually occurring on that path. But you know, it's got the way you protect yourself is to monitor the system all the time. You're monitoring its performance today before deployment of RLANs, and then you monitor it as RLANs are being deployed and confirm whether or not your path outages could be caused by interference. I know of no other way to do that.
Okay. And thank you, George. And I think another thing you mentioned prior was that we have been invited, there were those extra paragraphs at the commission to conduct physical tests ahead of the full deployment with the other stakeholders, best and worst case scenarios. And presumably if we run those tests now prior to the full deployment of the billion devices, and if we see, with a peer-reviewed federally managed spectrum test bed or other type of test where the data is available, we'll have an opportunity to bring that data to the commission and warn them ahead of time that there's some real problems here.
All right. Are there any other questions? Well, sounds like we warned everybody out, Joe.
Looks like let me see if there might be one more here. Let me double check. Bear with me. Yeah, no, we've covered the questions.
Okay, we'll make these slides available, and I believe we will be recording this, so the recording will also be available on the NSMA website. Joe, do we have any idea how long it will be before people can access that?
That should be accessible within about 2 days. We will send out a note about where people can send emails when that's up and live. If they want to continue to participate, we'll send a note also indicating when this recording is live, and we'll also send a note for any future events related to this proceeding or any other webinars. So that'll all be in the same missive, so everyone will have access to that data, and we'll keep it posted on the website as well. And George, just wanted to thank you again for bringing to bear your 40+ years of expertise on this very significant matter when it comes to incumbent operations and the 6 GHz band. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Joe. I hope this was helpful to folks.
Thank you, everyone.